Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Joining me this week on our Game Day segment is Isaiah Hole, who covers Michigan for USA Today's WolverinesWire and the Locked On Wolverines Podcast. I hope you're all well and looking forward to getting out and enjoying some of the nice weather if it ever gets here. In the coming weeks, we should have a decision on whether Michigan will have a football season and if fans will be a part of that game day experience. President Schlissel told the Wall Street Journal last weekend he hopes to have a decision in the next 2 weeks as to whether on-campus classes will begin in the fall. If they do, we should have football. We just have to wait and see. We cover that on today's Game Day segment and also discuss a big week in recruiting for Jim Harbaugh and his staff. It's a 40-minute segment today, so let's get to it. Joining us next is Isaiah Hole from USA Today's WolverinesWire here on the Michigan Man, so stay with us. Back with us on our Game Day segment this week is Isaiah Hole from WolverinesWire and also the host of the Locked On Wolverines Podcast. Once again, great to have you with us, Isaiah.
Of course. Glad to be here. Glad that we got another one in and only a couple weeks later.
No, absolutely. It has just been a few weeks, but there's a lot to talk about this week, actually. As we flip the calendar from May to June, it has been a very good recruiting week for Michigan, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And you know what? It kind of, a narrative kind of got destroyed in the sense of people were upset that Wolverines weren't seemingly recruiting as well on the defensive side of the ball compared to offense. And offense, you have all these guys that are 4 and 5 stars with one exception, and the 3-star wide receiver that's got 30-plus offers. But defensively, it was all 3 stars, and they kind of changed that narrative starting with Junior Colson, the Tennessee native who originally hails from Haiti, moved to the United States when he was 10 years old. And he's a guy that they recruited to play the Viper position, and seems like he's going to be waiting in the wings for that. Has a really impressive offer sheet. They went out and got Jaden Hood out of St. Thomas Aquinas. They already had a commitment from St. Thomas Aquinas, but that's a big time school. That's I would say one of those top 25 programs in high school. And they went out and got a 4-star linebacker there to go along with Jade McBurrows, who I think he just committed around the last time that I'd spoken with you. And both of them have incredible offer sheets. So 4-star, 3-star, kind of doesn't matter. Hood is a 4-star in this case, but you know, when you see that Alabama's offering, you usually can pretty much figure that that's a big time player. And then I certainly, maybe I'm not as plugged in as I could be sometimes, but I was a little bit surprised when they got Keyshawn Barnett, who committed late last night. Very late, really didn't see it coming, but he comes from Suffield Academy out of Connecticut, another 4-star defensive end this time, and got a lot of upside, and one of those types of guys that again plays at one of the better schools, one of the more well-known schools in the New England region, and actually has been evaluated to get that 4-star, which is somewhat rare, and I think that regardless, when you getting these whether they're 3 stars or 4 stars on the defensive side, you know, there's just something of a track record there. It seems like Michigan has done really well, you know, at evaluating and figuring out who is going to be the best fit for what they want to do. So, yeah, you can point to stars and say that they matter, but you look and you see what Kwity Paye's doing, who seems to be Don Brown's favorite player on defense. You know, he was a very low 3-star out of Rhode Island, and you've got guys like Josh Metellus that was a 2-star at the time he committed, and rose to a 3-star by the time that the signing day came, but certainly wasn't a household name. Seemed like he was the lesser of the 3 in the Flanagan trio, and yet he got drafted this year. So a lot of kudos to the staff for not only getting the guys that they want, but also making evaluations. And I think that's one of those things that people need to remember. And it wasn't like they were going to go the whole cycle without getting some high-end guys. It's just the nature of recruiting is this is around the time when players tend to commit, May and June, maybe July and August a little bit as well. But rarely are guys carrying it all the way to, the All-American Bowl or signing day. Sometimes that does still happen, but that's become more of an outlier these days. So you knew that they were going to get some of their higher-end prospects more around this time of year. We'll see how it continues because, without visits, things are a little bit different. And, the NCAA just extended the dead period as far as visitation is concerned all the way to July 31st. So this is truly the new normal, and Michigan's doing an unbelievable job of navigating it, to be honest.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we're up to the number 8 class in the country, I think, by just about everyone that gauges the recruiting. So it's a great class right now. And just here in the state, Isaiah, with Rocco Spindler and some of the other names we've been following for the last year, this could get much better very soon, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of guys that are on the docket. They're on the clock, so to speak, that Michigan's looking at in some of these classes, Spindler being one of them. That, to me, feels like a Michigan-Notre Dame battle. I'd spoken to him about a month ago about where he is in his recruitment. He dropped his top 5 recently, but at the same time, it really does feel, and it's felt like this to me for a very, very long time, that it was going to come down to Michigan and Notre Dame, and they both are relatively similar, but also offer a very unique experience. Both have current players and such that are talking to them, and current recruits as well as current players that are trying to get them on board. But he's not the only one that Michigan's going after. You look at guys like Christian Dixon from Mater D and the wide receiver. He's another guy that he's got you look at 24/7 Sports, he's got a 92% crystal ball now for his services. He's got an LSU and Oregon offer, as well as Notre Dame was one that had a prediction. They're doing pretty good with Xavier Worthy, another California wideout. Again, you're looking at some of these high 4-star type guys as far as those are concerned. And then you get to Donovan Edwards, the West Bloomfield product. I spoke to someone this past week, and they had said that Michigan had really turned things around because everything that I had kind of gotten from that, from the program as far as West Bloomfield is concerned, or even from Donovan himself, it just kind of felt like Michigan was falling really far behind. They had seemed to kind of put all their eggs in the Travion Henderson basket. And before that got too late, they turned it around and made sure that Edwards knew that he was a priority. And it seems to be paying off. There's still some ways to go there. He might be on the later spectrum as far as his decision's concerned. But he's still considering 7 to 10 schools, I'm told. He's the real big must-get of this class, especially since J.J. McCarthy's long been in the class. So that one's another big one. But there's still some other guys out there. They're still trying after Drew Kendall, the 4-star interior offensive lineman from Massachusetts, who's best friends with Casey Finney, who's a current commit. And that one to me feels like that's got to go Michigan's way. But there's a lot of targets that they have available that are going to start making those types of decisions. Their board is a lot clearer now. They've pretty much filled up that linebacker. You still want to try to get a defensive tackle. Whether Jay Toya is still on the board or not, I'm not sure. The USC commit, he's a guy they've been after for quite some time. Quentin Somerville, defensive end from Arizona. A litany of top-end 4-star type players, maybe 5-star. They're still heavily after Thomas Fedone, tight end out of Iowa. That seems to be between Nebraska, Michigan, and Alabama. I haven't talked to Thomas myself personally, but Michigan's done a really good job. I know they feel really confident based off of some conversations that I've had with some people about Fedone also still being kind of into the Michigan thing. But you got all those guys that are still out there that I just mentioned are 4-stars. You figure they'll add another cornerback. whether that be Tyreek Chappell or there's a couple others I know that they're into. There's a 4-star whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a plenty of guys that Michigan could reel in, and they're all high-end guys. I'm sure there will still be another 3-star or two in the class. I didn't even mention Rayshon Benny, the defensive tackle from Oak Park.
Yeah.
Most schools are recruiting him as an offensive lineman. Michigan seems to be the only one recruiting him at defensive tackle. So that's one where you can look at it and see, like, okay, does he want to continue his career on offense, or does he want to come and be a defensive player? And it doesn't seem like Michigan's necessarily leading, but at the same time, stranger things have happened. He had a teammate that had that same impulse last year in Justin Rogers. I did his commitment video. He committed to Kentucky, and he stuck with it, which no one, including myself, who made his commitment video, thought he was going to do. But that was because everyone was recruiting him as an offensive lineman, and he wanted to play defense. So and I don't think anyone thought it was going to be Kentucky, at least in the end, by the time everything was said and done. So that's another battle that they're facing, and so you got to feel pretty confident. They've already got a really good class. I know people are going to compare it to Ohio State.
Yeah.
I would resist that impulse because Ohio State is bringing in a generationally good class right now. That's just unfortunate that's Michigan's rival, but Michigan's doing as good as anybody at finding some guys, and I think that the ones that they have that are 3-stars, you got to like a lot of them. Marcus Allen from Ohio, Northmont, Ohio. He's exactly the type of prospect that you want to see in the speed and space offense, for instance. And that's the one offensive player, but they really love TJ Guy, the defensive end from Massachusetts. He's a guy that they have wanted him for a while now, and I know that people fall in love with the little stars next to their name, but it's not always the perfect indicator. And I think that Michigan's track record, like I mentioned earlier in the draft, has kind of proven that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's the new normal right now, and that's extending to the recruiting world, because I'm watching, these kids commit, and it's very different than the last few years. And even in the last few years, the recruiting world has changed dramatically with the early signing period. But at this point, do we expect things to slow down, or is there just no telling when these kids are going to commit right now?
I think there's no telling. I think that's been pretty evident with some of these commitments that have come from somewhat out of nowhere. I'm not talking about last night's with Barnett, but you just kind of don't know when some of these guys are going to commit. And that's just a general thing, not even with the pandemic. You think back to relative to this time last year, I remember having a conversation with Jordan Morant, and he told me his plan was to commit on I believe the Army All-American Bowl. So we're talking first week of January. It was less than a week, and he was committed to Michigan. It's a lot of these times the timelines move up, and guys realize sometimes that they've seen everything that they need to see, or because they've gotten quite a few. Not all of these guys have been on campus, but they've gotten quite a few of their top guys already on campus, and that's one of the things that I sometimes don't even realize until they put out their top group of schools. And then I usually am just looking in my photo albums of all the photos I took at the games, and sometimes I go and I'm like, all right, I know that Ed Warner's recruiting this guy, or Don Brown's the main guy here, and I'm like, well, let's just search to see if my old recruiting writer got something from them and talked to them at some point. And it turns out I have a picture of them that I took at the games, and I obviously didn't know who they were because at that time they weren't a national level recruit. Whether it was last year or the year before, it happens time and time again. They've been really good, I think, in that light at making those early evaluations. And so sometimes these guys get onto the national radar. When Greg Crippen flips to Michigan, which I didn't foresee from his Notre Dame commitment, I had like 3 pictures of him already in my gallery. And I had no idea that I even though I posted a story, but being like, here's everyone who visited for the Middle Tennessee game. That's another example of a guy that, granted he was committed to another school, but he had been to Michigan and he knew that Michigan was the right place for him, and he made that flip. But he wasn't a national recruit necessarily when he visited, because he was about to start at IMG Academy. He had been playing actually in Massachusetts, yet another Massachusetts guy. That's just how the story goes sometimes. It's not necessarily it's not an exact science, I think is the best way you can put it. And when you're a 16, 17-year-old kid trying to figure out where you want to go to school and spend the next 3 to 5 years of your life, those things can somewhat change on a whim. So I would expect more abnormality when it comes to schedules, timelines. I think you might not necessarily see the big rush of commits that you normally would see in June. I could very much be wrong on that, but those usually coincide with that big visit weekend that they have near the end, and they aren't going to be able to have that. So I wouldn't be surprised if some guys like Rocco had told me that his plan was to commit either in May or mid-May or early June, and he's obviously not making that choice now. Now it's going to be more of a late summer scenario, and he's going to do the hat dance at his school. So some plans are changing because the pandemic has somewhat changed it for them. But to that same regard, some guys feel like they've seen enough, whether they've been to campus or not. So they make that decision right away, and part of that is they're getting to bond a lot more with the coaching staff due to the fact that everyone's a lot more free now than they would have been otherwise.
One of the questions that I get a lot this time of the year is, fans will look at, okay, we have 20 commitments or however many that we have, and they'll say, how big is this recruiting class going to be? And with all the big fish that we're still in on, what would your guess be as far as how many commits we're going to get this year?
I said this on the podcast earlier because Thursday's always the mailbag. So I did a late podcast, and someone asked me that exact question. And that's not something I ever really worry about, because in a way, they're not going to fill up. Or they'll fill up exactly to what, the point that they want to. And that's because there's always unforeseen attrition, whether it be the guys who are already here, the guys who are coming. We saw that unfortunately last year with the wideout who from Caden Colasar's school, who ended up being medically disqualified. Sometimes that happens, and that will free up somebody, or on top of that, they're not going to turn a guy away. And sometimes that equals attrition that you really don't want to see, the so-called running guys off, the purging. But we've seen that in the Harbaugh era since his first year, starting with Eric Swenson. They're not afraid to say, hey, you're not fit enough to cut it here. Granted, he landed pretty softly by going to Oklahoma, which has just continued to go to college football playoffs in the meantime. But they haven't been afraid to say, all right, well, you have to progress, and you have to get to that certain point where this is you want us and we want you. It has to be mutual on signing day. So I really don't like putting a hard number on it, because I think it's really unpredictable. And ultimately, if there's a high 4-star or 5-star that they really want, and they seem, quote, full up, they'll probably find a way to get him on campus one way or another. And the other part is the fifth years. I think we have a pretty good handle right now on who, all the fifth-year guys that are coming back. But it's I wouldn't. I'm not saying that this is something Michigan would do, but I wouldn't put it past to see some more attrition there, just for the sake of. You just don't know how things are going to play out. It's more of the uncertainty than the actual forcing out. Maybe a guy gets to fall camp. It always seems like you have a couple that don't make it through fall camp, decide they're going to transfer. Heck, we've seen in recent years guys make it through a couple games and decide they're going to transfer. Jamarick Woods was one of them. Granted, he was a guy that kind of seemed like he was ready to transfer before, based off some things that I heard, but Jordan Anthony. I unexpected Jordan Anthony was only a couple weeks removed from having that excellent game against the Army where he finally kind of got on the field quite a bit and got some rave reviews the following week from Don Brown. But clearly didn't feel like this was the right place to finish his career. So it happens when you get that far down the road. You'll have some unexpected attrition. So it's hard for me to actually put a number on it. So I don't really track scholarships for that reason, because it's more of, hey, if it seems like they're full up and Rocco Smith wants to come here, I know it's a bad example because he'll be deciding sooner than later, but if they get to that point and there's a guy that they really feel could really help make the team better, chances are they'll have a scholarship available. If they don't, we've seen some instances where, maybe a guy that wasn't quite ready for Michigan ends up at another school, and more often than not works out too. Rashad Weaver's a guy I'm thinking of there that ended up at Pitt. So it's that's kind of the nature of it. I don't like to dwell too much on the numbers because they're always in fluctuation.
Well, when you look at the recruiting scene right now, Ohio State, as you mentioned, and as we all know, is on another planet as far as recruiting. Are you surprised that Ryan Day has more than picked up where Urban left off?
To some degree, but not really. He was already a voracious recruiter, he surrounded himself with voracious recruiters, right? So that's, especially by picking off two guys that Michigan had some success with. Less Al Washington than Greg Madison, but Greg Madison was an ace recruiter. Mark Pantoni, who's led the charge, they're behind the scenes has been excellent as it has been, and Ohio State has long been a national brand. I'm probably a little bit more surprised that he made Ohio State look even more like a juggernaut than it did before. That to me was a little bit more surprising than the rest. But you get a young guy like him who can go out there and sell you. He seems really genuine. I find him, aside from the fact that he's wearing a Block O, I find him really hard to dislike. Like, just having talked to him at Big Ten Media Days last year, I couldn't help but be impressed, and I didn't have that smarmy used car salesman feeling that you get from Urban. It was completely different. You kind of felt like having Coach Taylor from Friday Night Lights sitting there talking to you. He's that type of guy. So I'm not surprised that they've somewhat followed up this this particular special year. I know they didn't get to the promised land, but I certainly thought they had a shot. They seemed to kind of implode in that second half against Clemson. But I don't think there are many people that didn't think that they weren't at worst a top 2 team. I know they didn't finish outside of that, but even though Clemson won that game, they certainly had the look of being a team that could give LSU a run for the money. And when you win like that, especially coming off of year one, I mean, look at what Harbaugh did coming off of his first season. Surprisingly taking Michigan to 10-3. Then he brings in, Rashawn Gary and all, this unbelievable class in 2016, at least on paper at that time. That's kind of the nature of what you're going to get when you have a high caliber team the way Ohio State does. They haven't had the down years that Michigan's had, and that's one of those things I like to remind people when people, expect wins against Ohio State. Look at their won-loss records over the course of pretty much their entire history. I mean, you don't see any more than like a 2 or 3 year blip on the radar going all the way back to 1930 something. They've had an incredible run, and there were a couple middling years there, but they had usually no more than 3 and usually closer to 2, and then rebounded. I mean, we saw that in modern history, after the 2011 season. That's really difficult to beat, and whereas there's a lot of young players out there at the high school age or the middle school age that only know Michigan as being like a 9-10 type win team. They don't know the struggles of Ohio State, because Ohio State, every single year that they've been alive, I mean, every single year that you and I have been alive for the most part, they've been dominant. And the difference is between the perception now and the perception in, say, the 90s, is they were just as elite under John Cooper, but John Cooper couldn't beat Michigan. For whatever reason, Michigan always had his number. And under Bo Schembechler, when Michigan was rolling, he and Woody Hayes or Earl Bruce, it didn't really matter who was there, they always at worst split. So that hasn't been the case since Jim Tressel took over, and they've had one bad year, exactly one bad year, since all the way back in the early 2000s. And we're talking about kids who were born in the 2000s. So it's a lot easier to recruit when you've just been this powerhouse forever. And because you can sell something and people are going to believe it no matter what, because you've already produced the results. And that's kind of the uphill battle Michigan has to face, is can you get over that proverbial hump? Because Michigan does not have that same track record. We might think of them as a dominant team because we're older. And I remember when I went back to school, because I had left for a while, when I went back to school in the middle of the 2000s, I remember getting in a cab in Las Vegas, and my mom told the cab driver, my son goes to Michigan, and he's like, oh, that's an elite football team. You know, that's 2006, and coming off of a 7-5 season. And the perception, regardless of having a down year like Michigan had in 2005, and this, you know, this was on the day of the season opener when Michigan beat Vanderbilt, and it wasn't like this crazy lopsided score. The perception was still Michigan is an elite football program. They win big games. And right now, that isn't the narrative that's going on. Michigan wins big games, but they don't win the game. They don't win the bowl games. And they don't win the big ranked games on the road. So Michigan has to vanquish those things, and that's an uphill battle. But it still feels to me, despite it being 5 years in Jim Harbaugh's tenure, that they're on the right track for all that.
Yeah, and you know, I think we're on the right track too. It's not as fast as a lot of our fan base would like, especially some of our older fans. You know, I heard Saban say one time that even though he coaches at Alabama and everyone that's, you know, of a reasonable age knows about the history of Alabama, but he said he's always thought when you're recruiting high school kids, to them, the history of your university is what happened 2 years ago. And you know what? We all remember being 16 and 17. I think that's a very valid point.
Oh, absolutely. And Alabama was one that, I mean, it had talent. See, here's the misperception that a lot of people have. And I've been railing on Georgia particularly for a while here because, like, Alabama had talent. They just didn't have the coaching in place that could take advantage of it. And Saban kind of came at the right time. Alabama was somewhat languishing. They were a middling team, but it had talent. And when they won their first one, they weren't Alabama yet. They weren't what we know now as this absolute juggernaut, the best overall team in college football. Like, that's not what they were then. You know, they lucked out by an injury to Colt McCoy in the opening foray of that BCS national championship game. But you can have all the talent. You know, there's a mixture that has to happen. You have to have coaching and you have to have talent. For all the slurping that Kirby Smart gets, I don't really get it. And I understand they won the SEC a couple years ago. They went to the college football playoff, and they went to the championship game and lost in overtime. Great. I saw a metric today showing that they have 16 former 5-stars on their roster, the most in college football. 16.
Yeah.
Alabama has 13. Like, you should be winning everything at that rate. And to me, like, they lucked out big time the year that they did win the SEC and go forward by the fact that Auburn beat a otherwise undefeated Alabama team. I think they were undefeated, one-loss Alabama team, I think, because they had lost to Ole Miss. They beat that team, and so it was Auburn versus Georgia, not Alabama versus Georgia. And by the time that those two teams met in the national championship, Alabama won that game. In my eyes, even going into the national championship game, Georgia wasn't even the best team in its conference. It was the best team in its division because who's given them any kind of run for anything. Florida tends to constantly be overhyped, in my opinion. I saw the ESPN's future ranking, the top 25 of what's going to go on in the next 3 years. And Georgia was top 5, I believe. I think that's fair because of the talent, but Florida was ranked number 7, and it said their offense was going to be the 7th best offense in the country. To me, when you look at that, it's like the SEC is excellent. I'm not taking away from it. It's one of those conferences, I feel, where a team can look pretty good and suddenly they're given the same kind of clout that Alabama has, or LSU did this last year. To me, that Georgia's been just riding on the coattails, particularly of Alabama, in so many ways, because you have a former Alabama defensive coordinator in Kirby Smart, and he had some really good success in 1 year, but otherwise, for the most part, it's been a disappointment. Yes, he can make that championship game, but who does he have to get through? He has to get through South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Missouri. It's not the SEC West. It's not even the Big Ten East that they have to get through. At best, it's the Big Ten West. So it's a little disappointing when you see a school like that have that much talent and can't get to that promised land, but they're given the benefit of the doubt. And to tie that into Michigan, the reason I mention that is because Michigan tends to get the narrative that Georgia should be getting, because Michigan has an Ohio State problem. That's obvious. Michigan doesn't really have a Penn State or Wisconsin problem. At worst, they're even, considering those two teams tend to, the home team wins every single year, at least in the Jim Harbaugh era. But they have to get past Ohio State for that perception to change, because people aren't willing to give Michigan that benefit of the doubt. And that's how the narrative is. That's the only way the narrative can change, is by, unfortunately, trying to get past one of the best teams in memory, and a team that seems to just consistently be getting better. So it takes coaching. And I think that they have that. I like the staff that they have. I like the new additions on defense, having 2 former defensive coordinators. Bob Shoop, only a couple years ago, had the number 1 defense in the country, and he's worked with Don Brown before. So he, A, knows exactly what to do in a Don Brown defense. And B, if he knows that something's not working, he'll have enough of a clout to be able to say, hey, we got to change this thing up that we're doing. And then Brian Jean-Marie, who didn't have as successful of a defensive coordinator stint on his resume, having been the last couple of years at USF, but has the recruiting prowess, was the recruiting coordinator at Texas, which obviously is a giant school, and knows the lay of the land. And we've seen that with some of the recent commits that Michigan's brought in, and Colson and Hood. So I really like what they're doing, both on the trail and on the field. And it's, you hope for overnight progress, and I think people really were spoiled by that first 10-3 season that happened. But I think that was just an incredible coaching job that ended up happening in year one, that kind of made everyone think that things were going to be a little bit better. And hey, Harbaugh, I think, was right. They were extremely close in 2016, and you can't convince me that wasn't one of the best 4 teams in the country, despite the 2 losses to start the season, or to end the season rather. But things played out the way they did, and you have to erase that and somehow continue to bring in high-level guys and then get them to perform up to the top. And to me, they're making all the right moves. And you've seen that with Josh Gaddis. That started to click late. I think in a couple years from now, if you can keep the band together, so to speak, Michigan fans will eventually be really happy.
I think so, too. I think the big thing, as you said, we have an Ohio State problem, and we all know that. And when it comes to recruiting, Isaiah, I think about this a lot. Everyone says we just need to break through. We need a win. But, I really think we need more than that. It's got to be maybe every other year, put a streak together. It'd be nice if we put one together like Ohio State's done to us, but it's really going to take something like that. It's got to be an extended string of victories to really get in the same conversation with them on the recruiting level, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, because you can lose. If you're Ohio State, you have some house money to play with. You can lose a couple and still be like, hey, yeah, this was a blip on the radar. Like, I think if Michigan would have gone in and won 2018, it would have been a lot harder for Ohio State because Michigan was on a clear upswing. You had a former five-star in Shea Patterson, kind of handcuffed in the offense he was in, and they were the hottest team in the country when they played Ohio State, essentially. I mean, aside from Clemson and Alabama and all of those schools. But if you were able to win that year, you could at least point back to 2017 against a team that had no business struggling against Michigan the way that Ohio State did. And 2016, that's another one where you can't convince me that Ohio State was better than Michigan. It's just a series of circumstances that unfortunately didn't go Michigan's way, and a lot of it you couldn't control. I mean, I was there in the horseshoe on the sidelines, and I agreed with Harbaugh and his less with the spot, because the spot was what it was, and once they called it what it was, you couldn't change it. But that pass interference call against Delano Hill, I mean, I had a really good vantage point from that. I was on that same side of the field, and I was past the line of scrimmage, but somewhere in between the line of scrimmage and the spot where the ball was thrown to, and it wasn't uncatchable and by. Not to relitigate that game, but if you have those two things in your back pocket, if you're Michigan, you can at least say, look, we've been close. We were arguably the better team. It just didn't work out that way in 2016. 2017, that supposed elite team could not put us away. And then 2018, you could be like, and then we finally got over the hump and went on from there. But things played out the way they play out, so you kind of have to start that over. You have to find something that's going to work, which is easier said than done given the roster they have down there in Columbus. But, I mean, Ohio State can go to anybody and basically pitch exactly who they are, and that's an easy sell. Michigan has to pitch what it wants to be, and that's to me the harder sell, because with Ohio State, all you have to do is say, hey, more often than not, we win the Big Ten. Whenever the College Football Playoff Committee decides to not penalize us for losing one game in the regular season, albeit they've been some pretty bad losses, we make it to the College Football Playoff. We won the first College Football Playoff as well. So we can do whatever we want as far as that's concerned. Come here and you'll at least have all that. Michigan has to more so point to, what it could do. The good news is they have they've done really, really well in the NFL draft. And you especially, I think, can sell more of the middling four-star guys on it, in the sense of, hey, you're going to go. If you come to work every day, you do what we say, you're going to go to the NFL. You're going to get your shot. But as far as the on-field stuff, they can't really promise the types of things that Ohio State can just yet. And once they can at least get over the hump once, and I'm assuming that if they did, that they would make it to Indy, they would make it to the College Football Playoff, then you can start being able to be a little bit less proactive in that light. But on top of it, I think one of the issues that Michigan faces is not just that the losing streak, it's that Ohio State is so relentless on the recruiting trail, as if they haven't won anything. And I think that doesn't help either, because I've heard directly from many recruits, that Ohio State has wanted and Michigan has wanted, that Ohio State is usually, out of any school, the most active. And that's not a knock against Michigan. It tends to be like, even against schools like Alabama and otherwise. Ohio State is just really, really good at persistence. That doesn't necessarily work for everybody, but Michigan kind of needs a mixture of everything. And I think that's to kind of bring that back. That is what they kind of get in a guy like Ryan Jean-Marie. And it kind of revitalizes the efforts more. I think that this pandemic in general has revitalized Michigan's recruiting efforts because guys that said to me before that they wish they heard from Michigan more now are more than content with the frequency and say that Michigan's recruiting them harder than any other school, and that's one of those things that you want to hear from top flight prospects. So it's a little bit of a bunch of different things that Michigan has to do to be able to win some of those battles, and they seem to be on the right track. But like I said, the results on the field make it really difficult because you have to sell something that hasn't happened in recent memory compared to what Ohio State's able to bring to the table.
A final question for you, Isaiah, before we let you get out of here, and this is back to our new normal, the new world we're living in. Last week I was getting the feeling, I was excited. I thought, hey, we're going to have a college football season in some form. But then on Sunday, we heard from Dr. Schlissel in that Wall Street Journal interview, and he said without students on campus, there will be no football. That was not very encouraging, was it?
No, but at the same time, it does seem like that was more of a doomsday scenario. I had kind of heard through just not even they weren't back channels by any means. They were just kind of voices out there on the Twitter sphere and otherwise saying, well, the good news is he's more likely than not to have classes in person on campus in some way or another. And he had a Zoom call apparently with my ex-colleague, Zach Shaw, with 24/7 Sports. He posted this on Twitter that he was on with students on Zoom and said that, or at least intimated that there's a likelihood that there will be in-person classes this semester, or this fall rather. And it seems like it's trending that way. So while it did seem kind of like a harrowing thing to hear and kind of a foreboding mention in the Wall Street Journal, I mean, I know that my jaw dropped a little bit. I also kind of looked at it this way. If Ohio State is going to have in-person classes and Michigan State's going to have in-person classes, and Ohio State, we already kind of knew that was going to be the case. I don't know if they've officially announced it, but just considering all of the steps and measures they've taken, it's been pretty obvious that that's going to be the case. And Michigan State announced sometime earlier this week. I was like, there's no way Michigan's not going to. And to that same degree, just logically, there was no way, regardless, that if Ohio State fields a football team, that Michigan's not going to, because you're not going to give yourself the death penalty, even if it is a public health crisis. You're going to find a way. You're gonna bend that some way, and then you're gonna take care of the testing and all of the types of things that Jim Harbaugh's been talking about for the last week and a half on at his various appearances. So to me, even though he said that to the Wall Street Journal, it just didn't logically make sense that the way it was framed, that hey, other schools might have football, but there's a chance Michigan won't. I just was looking at it and said, there's no way that would happen. I understand as a public health crisis, but there's a way around all of that. You don't have to give yourself a self-imposed death penalty, because it would have been catastrophic, or it would be catastrophic if some of these other schools had football and Michigan said, no, we're gonna handle this without it, and Michigan would probably never recover from that to become what it wants to be again. If that was to happen. So I would put my money on there being some form of in-person classes. It might not be full classes. It might not be business as usual, but it would be enough to where it would warrant there being a football schedule still forthcoming this fall. So as dire as that made it look, I don't foresee that happening unless the whole country takes a massive turn downward.
I think we're going to have football this year. The one thing that I have a hard time believing, though, is that we're going to have any fans in these stadiums. Maybe in the SEC, they're playing with some of these 20,000 social distance crowds. I think that's got to be a nightmare to work out. But in Big Ten country, can you imagine fans at games this year?
Yeah, but it would have to be exactly what you said. I would imagine that if they can safely do it, they'll find a way. Especially a place like Michigan Stadium. I mean, it's a behemoth. You know, you can spread people out and whatever. And I think the logistical nightmare would be more so figuring out who those fans would be
right.
that would be allowed to come. You know that there are probably not going to be a lot of people that are going to say like, well, you know, we're coming out of a pandemic, let's stay home. You know, they're going to brave it for that chance to go to the big house. So I would imagine there would be some form of fans in the stadium. It just might not be. I mean, maybe it's just parents, maybe it's just students, maybe it's some combination of those and some season ticket holders. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are fans there, but I think we can basically count out at this point, if for no other reason that the governor has already said that this won't happen, that I can't imagine you're going to see a packed stadium. But hey, you know what? It'll kind of work out for Michigan State. They'll get to continue to have just as many fans that would show up anyway at Spartan Stadium, regardless of the current circumstances. So, but as far as Michigan's concerned, no, I don't foresee there being a sold-out big house. I think that streak's probably, unfortunately, going to come to an end this year, but we'll see. You know, I don't really like to either suggest that what's going to happen, because you know the disease could get worse,
mm-hmm.
or it could be eradicated by then. We really just don't know. Yes, it would be a miraculous thing, more so if the latter thing I just said happened, but I would also say weirder things have happened as well in this world. So, you know, by the time we get to September 12th, you know, things could look radically different than they do now. So, to me, it's, even though they're going to have to be making decisions here within this next month, I mean, it's a little bit different to say no, you can't come, compared to no, you can, because I'm sure that if it's late in the game and things seem to be pretty much in the clear, you know, they'll figure out a way to get people to pack those bleachers.
Absolutely. Our guest here on our show today on our Game Day segment with great stuff as usual has been Isaiah Hole from WolverinesWire. He's also the host of the great podcast, Locked On Wolverines Podcast is the title of it, so check it out. We'll put it up in the show notes. But Isaiah, it's always great having you on the show, and I hope the next time that we chat down the road, it's about who Michigan's playing next.
That would be nice. Hopefully that's the case.
All right, Isaiah, well, thank you for your time, and we look forward to that next visit.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Thanks again to Isaiah Hole for being with us today. He does know his stuff, and he'll be back during the summer months as we prepare for the upcoming season. That does it for this week, though. A reminder, we are on our summer schedule of 2 shows a month in May, June, and July. Then back to regular weekly programming in August when we start previewing football season. And that's right, I am optimistic we will have a season in some form or fashion. In the next 2 weeks, we should have more news as to what that season will look like and if fans will be in stadiums in some very limited way. Our next show airs on June 10th, so make sure you join us. Mark it on your calendar. Until then, I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue.
Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!